Mark, this is always so much fun. Thanks so much for returning. I want to start by just going pretty big. You've been talking for a while both about the destructive myth of austerity. Actually, could you do that just a little bit? I know this is already in the rear view mirror, but from the perspective
Oh,
of
don't
your
worry, it's coming again.
yeah, that's right.
Well, the subtitle of the book
Yeah,
was, the history of a dangerous idea. And the definition in the book of a dangerous idea is one that's immune to empirical refutation. So
right.
that pretty much sums it up. So basically, at some point soon, next time there's a financial crisis, probably leverage loans or something like that will tip over a bank, and then we'll all be like, what are we going to do? And then someone will say, well, we need to tighten our belts. And someone will say, well, if you think about it, a family that spends too much, like they have to rein in their expenditure, and that's what the government has to do too. And then I have to come out and go, all right, how many families do you know get to bring people into the family and tax them for 5 or 6 generations? None. How many families get to issue their own currency? Particularly if you're the United States and it's the global reserve currency, that's pretty important. None. Intergenerational taxation, check, got that one. Oh, bond market. Do you get to do debt through your children? No, you don't. So, in other words, a family and a household and a state, particularly the United States, is nothing like each other, right? Yeah, pretty much. Why do you keep saying it is? Because I'm a billionaire and I don't want to pay any taxes.
That's the politics of it, and for sure. Why is it? What struck me when I read your book, and I'd like you to comment on again, is also just this. It actually does reveal the power of language too, because it's this incredible. You in the family analogy, in analogies like, well, I've been partying a lot, and I'm drinking a little too much. I've got to get myself on a regimen. I got to take a run. I got to drink more water, as if the economy is the analog of that in terms of, cut down the spending, cut down the waste, get healthy. And then,
Right.
of course,
But
that's,
here's the
yeah,
fundamental thing. Look, that may be true, particularly if you're you and you live in Brooklyn and you're like, what, half my age. Then,
yes.
yeah, you should drink less and you should probably go for a run every now and
Well, I
again.
do run. And as for the rest of it, mind your business, Mark.
Well, I'm just simply
Yeah.
saying
Okay.
it's true in your case because you're a unique individual. Your
Right.
consumption has nothing to do with anybody else's, right?
Right.
Unless you lash out and get violent when you're drunk, right? Then there's externalities. But it doesn't work with government budgets for the simple reason that if the private sector is saving, then by definition, if the government sector saves as well, all that happens is the economy shrinks. Now, we did an experiment on this in real time. It was called Greece, right? And what we said to Greece was, well, we know that your bond market's under pressure, so your government has to like cut spending. And given the government spending in Greece was pretty important when you did that, and there was also a big recession elsewhere in Europe, it meant that the private sector went, oh, hang on a minute, I'm not going to spend any money now, I better save too. And what happened was Greek GDP, gross domestic product, fell by 25%. And they ended up with, I think, 40% more debt than when they started. And that was without issuing any new debt. The denominator basically shrunk and the numerator exploded. So yeah, it just doesn't work. There's no way you can do that, right? Basically, you can look after yourself or not. Your family can be budgetarily thrifty or not. It has nothing to do with anyone else. Government's very different.
How do we debunk, as it comes back, the debt myth, which is well, you say all that, but the debt is coming.
Well, the debt is coming, but all right, I'll give you an example of this, right? So every year I give a talk to a branch of the United States military. And without going into details, they're a nice bunch of folks. But anyway, I give them a walk in and I say, ladies and gentlemen, the national debt is a crisis. And the national debt is the same as gross domestic product. It's $17 trillion. It's a disgrace. How can we possibly be a world leading country that affords the things that you guys need in the military? So we need to get rid of this. Who agrees with me? And every hand goes up. And I was like, great, okay, that's great. So if you had the power at the stroke of a pen to reduce the national debt by 50%, would you do it? Every single hand goes up. These are not foolish people. And then I say, congratulations, ladies and gentlemen, you just destroyed half of national savings.
Mm.
Because the public debt is the national savings. They're called bonds, savings bonds. And people buy them because they're safe, but so-called liquid assets. So if you were to destroy the national debt, you would wipe out half of national savings. What else would that go into? Would it go into houses? Would it go into gold? Would it hopefully go into investment? We simply don't know. But the fact is, it's in debt because people like it, and one person's debt is another person's asset. And we completely wipe that out of the collective memory.
How do these cliches form? I mean, we understand that the reason why billionaires and oligarchs feed them because they want to rob the public and not pay their share. But how, in general, like, because even just the debt thing, and I'm not questioning the intelligence of your military friends at all. It's just that there's
You
so many.
shouldn't. They've got guns.
Right. Well, that was what I was thinking. I just didn't want to spell it out. But no, I mean, obviously they're brilliant guys. They do great jobs, and you should see them. I'm surprised you didn't describe it like Trump, where you said, I went in and they looked like Tom Cruise, except better.
Well, no, I was actually by far the most handsome person in the room, but that's an entirely different story.
I believe that. I have a very high standard for my guests, so there's no doubt about that.
What was your point?
My point was my point was a decent riff, but my point was how did these cliches? It's a very easy cliche to say. You can go in most rooms in America and say the deficit is a crisis, or for that matter, I'm a fiscal conservative but a social liberal. These things that don't actually even mean anything, and to the extent they do.
The contemporary equivalent of that is PAYGO.
Exactly. Explain that.
Right.
How did these things start? What is the cliche?
Well, it becomes a kind of self-reinforcing circle. So, I mean, when you give up on the notion that there is such a thing as a public good, which became essentially very contested in the 1960s for lots of different reasons, and into the 70s and the inflationary crisis, then you get the whole narrative that really catches hold of state bad, market good. Reagan walking out and saying the most dangerous thing anyone can say is I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Once you demonize the production of public goods and the agencies that do that, then it's very hard to make a kind of positive case for these institutions. These institutions run on taxes. People don't want to pay taxes because they've been told all these things are a waste of time. You shouldn't be paying taxes. Taxes is theft, Grover Norquist, all this nonsense, right? So basically you build up through the network of funding of billionaires, through think tanks, political parties, etc., this entire narrative of state failure and waste and so on and so forth. And then what do Democrats do everywhere? They go, yeah, kind of, I guess you're right. Whoa. That's terrible. Well, you know what? We'll be even more fiscally conservative than you. And yeah, we'll be even, yeah, exactly. So they completely lost the rationale and the arguments that they used to make for why that's just nonsense and should be called out as nonsense. One of the things that I love about the current moment is the fact that you've got some young Democrats in the party, without mentioning any obvious names, who are not afraid to basically say, no, this is nonsense. And we need to recognize it as nonsense. And then they get hell from the right-wing media, but then they just go, no, it doesn't matter how loud you shout it. At the end of the day, this is illogical rubbish. Stop saying it. And that's great.
Yeah, and that's a great segue to, in a minute, getting to the Green New Deal, because I can actually hear some of what even 6 months ago in one of our conversations, you were talking about just the idea of, first, of course, having this critique of injustice, but actually generating a positive, forward-looking, human, flourishing vision of economics. But before we get there, can you also re-review the history of the structure of how we got there in terms of center-left parties in the United States and Europe in particular, which is the kind of changing class composition of those parties, and the shift from activist organizing bases to sort of political consultant PR campaigns?
All right, so for anybody who's listening, watching, or otherwise consuming, there's a fabulous book you should get from Harvard University Press. It's from a sociologist by the name of Stephanie Mudge. And I forget the exact title. It's something along the line. I should remember because I blurbed the book. But it's called Reforming the Left or something like this. I forget exactly what it is. But anyway, it's like Sweden, the United Kingdom, the United States does all the great cases. And they all have this in common. And this is basically the story. In the 1970s, parties of the left still had real grassroots organizations. And they were connected to trade unions. And trade unions did crazy stuff like have classes for people where they would explain how the economy works and what's going on and all this sort of stuff, even in the United States. Not as quite as much as places like Sweden or Germany, but they did. And therefore, there was this kind of organic connection. In the 70s, with the inflationary crisis of the 70s and the first globalization shock, which is basically Japan and South Korea taking, in some sense, I don't want to sound like Trump, but I'm trying to be quick here. Basically, those industries migrated to East Asia, pushing us on top of the flight of industrial capital that you had trying to go to right to work states, for example, from Wisconsin to Texas and places like this. And you get that kind of first hollowing out of the Democratic coalition. Now, what is the lesson that the Democrats and New Labour in Britain, as it becomes, and the SPD in Germany take? Is right, we're going to resist this. So the first wave is resistance, and that just fails. Because in a sense, these parties are the establishment, and they've been seen to fail in some sense. So along comes this discredited right-wing old-time religion philosophy, Reagan, Thatcher, the rest of it. And what it does is it kind of reboots the system. And the way that the parties respond on the left is they hire technocrats. As Professor Mudge puts it, if I get it correctly, basically they find economists who are friendly to finance, strategists who will tell you how to win, technocrats will tell you what works and what doesn't and what policies you can choose. And you create this kind of technocratic infrastructure that only talks about policy rather than politics. Then along comes the second globalization shock for the United States. That's basically NAFTA. And then the third one, the China shock. And by that point, boom, that traditional Democratic constituency has been completely left at the same time as the Democrats have made this pivot towards basically embracing Wall Street and the sort of the Reuben Summers version of the world, which is exactly what they seem to be hurt by. So then along comes Trump and says, you guys got screwed by Wall Street in China. And, you know, is it any surprise it has massive resonance?
Yeah, right. And then we have that like very specific, like there's this book that I don't really recommend anybody read, to be honest, though he's a smart guy and has played a big role for better in some ways and many ways for worse in kind of modern center left politics. But Stanley Greenberg has this book of working with 5 different candidates, from Ehud Barak to Nelson Mandela to Bill Clinton to Tony Blair to Sanchez Goni de la Sada in Bolivia. And one of the things that's just amazing about it, though, is that this package of advice that almost always has to do with alienating traditional left constituencies, essentially,
Right.
as the sort of like prime brand package of what in the 90s was the most prominent Democratic consulting firm. I think now the consulting firms are a little bit more kind of distributed, but the ones that are getting hired by the DNC are still kind of peddling this stuff. And
Well,
probably
it was an incredible move at the time, right? I mean, you think
Yeah.
about it from the point of view of these firms, right? Even let's assume that their hearts are in their bodies, if not in the right place.
Sure.
Then what is it they're trying to do? They're trying to save the Democratic Party.
Yep.
So what do you need in this new environment of like everything's television? And you don't need members coming to meetings and complaining about stuff. You need donations. And there's this giant thing over there that's just been let loose over the past 10 years called Wall Street. And it turns out some of them are vaguely progressive. Well, why not just go there? You don't have to deal with like 40 people. You know, I remember my favorite line from Tony Blair was something along the lines of, it's a paraphrase, but he felt much better in a private jet than he did talking to trade unionists. And that kind of sums up that entire class.
That sums it up perfectly. And yeah, I mean, if the rumors about Tony Blair and Rupert Murdoch's wife are true, that's cool. But besides that,
can't possibly comment on those things.
I know that was side comment, Professor Blyth. You're not implicated by it at all. You just enjoyed that Michael Brooks Show video. And you can get a lot more by subscribing to us here at the Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel. It's literally right there.